When it comes to predicting what the next big thing will be, it's not always easy to do. For example, when One Piece began back in 1997, we doubt anyone would have guessed that this simple pirate manga would go on to be a massive 1,000+ chapter story years down the line. Even if that's not always obvious, there are always some educated guesses you can make. And today, we are going to be talking about a certain manga that we think can be the next major hit. Gachiakuta. It's got everything a great story needs. Compelling characters, fascinating world building, fast-paced action, and stellar artwork. So if you haven't read it yet, well, maybe this video can convince you. Let's talk about Gachiakuta and try to find out what makes it so special. First off, let's have an overview of the plot. Gachiakuta is the story of a young boy named Ruto, or possibly Ludo. It hasn't been officially translated into English, and his name has been translated both ways. But for this video though, we'll call him Ruto. So, Ruto is a poor boy living in a kingdom that appears to be a floating island surrounded by an endless abyss. For some reason, Ruto has a fascination with trash and often sneaks into the richer parts of the city to steal their garbage. He still finds value in things that other people throw out. Ruto's parents were both criminals and are no longer in his life, so he lives with a man named Ruto who acts as his father figure. Ruto is living the best life he can with Ruto until one day he comes home and finds out that Ruto has been murdered. The guards assume that Ruto was the killer and sentence him to death by dropping him into the abyss. But this is only the beginning of Ruto's story. It turns out that there is a bottom to the abyss. Ruto wakes up in what appears to be a giant landfill full of all of the trash that his Sky Island had been dropping for years. And not only that, but the landfill is full of giant monsters that disguise themselves amongst all the garbage. Ruto ends up being saved by a man named Engine, and this is where Ruto's life really changes. Engine is part of a group called the Janitors. Their job is to keep the people living in the abyss safe from the giant garbage monsters, which are called aberrant beasts. It also turns out that every member of the Janitors possesses something called a jinki. Essentially, if someone forms enough of a connection to an object, they can power up that object and use it in a number of ways, usually in combat. A jinki can be literally any object: an umbrella, scissors, and even a plunger. Ruto's jinki initially appears to be his gloves, but we soon learn that it's much more than that. It turns out that he's actually got an insanely powerful ability. Because Ruto is so empathetic to other people's trash, he can transfer the power of his jinki to literally anything he touches. Gachiakuta began in February of 2022, so the story hasn't actually gotten too far just yet. But the good news is that it's easy for new fans to catch up. One thing we like a lot about Gachiakuta is the artwork. It has a sort of exaggerated, cartoony style. It seems to take a lot of inspiration from the works of Atsushi Okubo. The character designs here look like they'd be right at home in the world of Soul Eater or Bleach. The exaggerated style of each character also fits in with the tone. While Gachiakuta can be dark at times, it still has a sense of fun to it, and the art helps emphasize that. Every character has a unique design that's instantly memorable. The mark of a good comic artist is being able to draw distinct characters. Even if reduced to a silhouette, you should still be able to tell these characters apart. Speaking of the characters, so far Gachiakuta has shown itself to have quite an interesting cast. Even the characters that we don't get to know all that well have a decent amount of development. Like in the first chapter that takes place on the Sky Island, there we meet Ruto's father figure, Ruto, and a girl he knows named Chiwa. The adventures of Ruto and Chiwa on the Sky Island could have easily been on their own manga, but Ruto losing everything and being dropped into the abyss is even more intriguing. Speaking of Ruto, let's talk about him for a moment. On a surface level, Ruto actually has quite a bit in common with another recent shonen protagonist, that being Denji from Chainsaw Man. Both Ruto and Denji are poor boys who end up in an organization that fights monsters. Like Denji, Ruto enjoys a lot of the new privileges being with the Janitors affords him. There's even an entire chapter dedicated to Ruto eating candy for the first time. The main difference between Denji and Ruto is that Ruto isn't quite as obsessed with women. In fact, so far there isn't much romance in Gachiakuta. Ruto did have a crush on Chiwa early on, but that was before he got dropped off the Sky Island. But who knows, it's still early in the manga. There may be more romance down the line. Other standout characters among the cast include Ruto's mentor figures Enjin and Nijik, and Ruto's fellow janitor, Ryu. Since we're still early in the manga, the characters are still being introduced, so you'll never know who you will meet next. Another aspect of Gachiakuta that's a whole lot of fun is the world building. When it comes to genre, this manga is categorized as fantasy. Usually when people say fantasy, what comes to mind is Dungeons & Dragons or Dragon Quest-inspired fantasy. Dragons, elves, dwarves, that sort of thing. In terms of anime, think of stuff like Konosuba or Re:Zero. But Gachiakuta doesn't rely as much on standard fantasy tropes. There are some things like the floating islands and the giant monsters living in the landfill, but the world of Gachiakuta has a lot of original flair to it. For example, at one point, we're introduced to a town of people who have dedicated their lives to street art. Literally, the entire town is covered in graffiti. In a certain way, the world of Gachiakuta sort of reminds us of One Piece, meaning that large parts of the story and world around it are bright and optimistic, but there's a darkness lurking behind. Of course, in One Piece, we really didn't see how dark the world was at first. But here, it's kind of the opposite. We're shown the dark stuff from the get-go. After all, the first chapter starts with Ruto being thrown into the abyss. It gets you ready for a series that'll be dark the whole way through, but later it shows the lighter side of things, like Ruto grossing a guy out by using a plunger as a weapon. The best part of the world building, in our opinion, is the Jinky power system. It's pretty standard for shonen action series like this to have some sort of magic system that our characters use. JoJo has stands, My Hero Academia has quirks, and even a comedy-based shonen like Ranma 1/2 has the Cursed Springs. So in the case of this world, the power everyone gets is their Jinky. At one point or another, we've all felt some emotional attachment to an object, whether it's a childhood stuffed animal or an old reliable pair of gloves. So the idea of that attachment literally giving you power is pretty cool. Plus, it allows for some really creative combat situations. You wouldn't think of some things that we see could be useful, but the author gets creative when it comes to the action scenes. Their idea of Jinky being really has been used to its fullest so far. And with this manga still having a lot of the story ahead, we'll definitely be seeing plenty more unique powers. As a whole, there's a lot to love about Gachiakuta, and we hope it's able to tell the full story. Not every manga gets that chance, but here's hoping that Gachiakuta has a long life. Not to mention, we hope that its mangaka, Kei Urana, has a successful career. Their art and writing are both very distinct, so we hope that they're able to make a name for themselves. Who knows, maybe a few years down the line we'll be doing a video on Gachiakuta anime adaptation. But until then, there's plenty of manga for you to read. If you haven't read Gachiakuta yet, we absolutely recommend it. It truly has what it takes to be the next big thing.